Hi and welcome back. I hope you are fine and taking precautions to safeguard yourself from the COVID-19. As you know that we have started a series on global environmental programs and policies in which we have already covered the background of the global environmental programs like Limits to Growth Report, Stockholm Conference, Brundtland Commission, IPCC report, and the most far-reaching report on global environmental programs and policies, that is the Rio Summit. In that we have extensively covered the Agenda 21, CBD and UNFCCC. Those who have missed the previous session, they may find the link below. Now in this module, we are going to learn about the global environmental programs after 1992. As you know that the UNFCCC provided a platform for COP or Conference of Parties for combating the climate change. Therefore, many UN sponsored conferences on climate change are actually COP conferences. So, they are known as COP 3, COP 4, COP 14 depending upon the terms of references in that negotiations. If the parties or countries are agreed to reduce the greenhouse gases, then it becomes diplomatic documents. For that, signature is necessary. So that becomes a binding thing. Or it may be converted into protocol such as Kyoto Protocol of 1997. This Kyoto Protocol became a legal treaty in the year 2001 at Bonn in Germany. Since then, it is known as Bonn Agreement. Therefore, agreement, protocols, treaties are more formal and binding than simply conferences. The conference may facilitate the agreement through negotiations. And as you know that in negotiation involves the parties in which each have something that the other wants. Which is a major issue in every UNFCCC or COP conferences. Let us understand this negotiation problem with the help of the present table. The table is showing the per capita emission of carbon dioxide in developed world and in developing world. Observe the per capita emission in USA, Australia and Canada. On the other hand, observe the emission levels in China, India, Bangladesh and Ethiopia. In general, it shows that the per capita emission levels are high in developed world, plus they are also historically responsible for the greenhouse gas emissions. Therefore, in general, during UNFCCC or COP conferences, this issue becomes an important issue during the negotiations time. And from the point of view of the developing countries, the demand for funds and technology transfer is another issue for the reduction of greenhouse gases. So, because that involves the technological changes in the way of production, and for that funds are necessary. And the developing world is also poor in terms of technology, and they have their other priorities. So, their fund is mainly diverted to the social issues. So, why the developed world would transfer the cutting edge technologies at free of cost, and that is another question for our common future. On the other hand, developed world also questions the China and also India in terms of aggregate greenhouse gas emissions. Let us understand the same problem from other point of view. The per capita emission, that is carbon dioxide emission from China is more than 6 tons per person per year. But if you see the aggregate terms, meaning total amount of carbon dioxide, anthropogenic, human generated carbon dioxide emission from China, then that is more than even USA. though China's per capita emission are lower than USA, Australia and Canada. Another central problem is the environmental standards set by the developed world. The economically actually weaker nations are reluctant to accept these standards which are set for the protection of the environment, because they don't have technology, and if we switch over to the another technology, then they will have to sacrifice the job opportunities which is created by already existing technologies. Even developed world also refuse to accept the standards set by them, whether latently or apparently. Therefore, the fault line between developed and developing world becomes apparent during the climate negotiations. We will try to understand this problem during successive COPs or COP Conference of Parties conferences. Now, let us begin with the next major development in the field of global environmental programs after Rio Summit. That was the Kyoto Protocol, and which was the result of UNFCCC, and it is also known as COP3 or Conference of Parties 3, that was created in the year actually in 1997. The Kyoto Protocol was finally ratified at Bonn in Germany on 23rd July 2001. Therefore, Kyoto or COP3 ultimately became a binding treaty to cut the greenhouse gas emissions in the world. In the Kyoto conference, it was proposed that all developed countries will reduce their emissions by around 5% and more properly 5.2% on their 1990 levels. Within 11 to 15 years, or by 2008 to 2012, depending upon the negotiations which generally take place during the COPs. I am repeating that targets for the reduction in the greenhouse gases were set for 2008 to 2012 by 5.2% of 1990 levels. However, the USA, when that George Bush was the president, so USA left the climate negotiation treaty because of their own development issues, since they will have to change the technologies which is actually harming or emitting the greenhouse gases. So, environmental friendly technologies at present level are generally less efficient than those technologies which are dependent on the fossil fuel resources. So, that is an issue for the US. So, this issue or leaving of Kyoto Protocol or conference by the US is sometimes considered as a big setback to the conference. The reason is that USA adds 25% of the total anthropogenic or human generated carbon dioxide emissions of the entire world. Also think that the United States population is equivalent to only 4.2% of the total population of the world, and the addition of CO2 is 25%. So, it is a setback to the Kyoto Protocol. The positive aspect of the Kyoto Protocol is that it can be considered as a corrective treaty, meaning it was binding to the signatory developed countries. I am repeating, developed countries, to reduce the greenhouse gases, since they have historical responsibility, meaning their total contribution of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere since pre-industrial level is far higher than the present day developing countries. So, some of the therefore, it was binding for developed countries. So, now let us see some of the important facts of this conference. So, please note down first it is that it created a common but differentiated responsibility. Second, binding targets to developed countries as listed in the Annex 1 category, and Annex 1 category incorporates the developed countries. Third, a clean development mechanism was created for Annex 1 countries to acquire the emission credits from the developing countries like Group 77, OPEC and African countries. It means that developed world is allowed to fund the projects in the developing world or developing countries to reduce the carbon dioxide emission in the developing countries or from the developing countries. So, in turn they are allowed to get the carbon credit out of this. That means they adjust this reduction from their own target. So, in negotiation term it may be called as win-win situation, but in terms of environmental sustainability it is one-sided, since targets were partially shifted elsewhere in developing countries rather than the problem areas, that is the developed world. Since the environmental problem or emission does not follow the you can say political boundaries. So, look at the map, shown map, and observe the spatial distribution of carbon dioxide emissions, and notice it is more in north, meaning developed world. But the concern is that approximately 75% population of the world lives in the developing world, and north controls the finance also and also the technology. Now, what we can conclude out of this discussion, that it created a clean development mechanism, which is a wonderful idea of the Kyoto Protocol, and that was ultimately ratified in the year 2001. As I have already told you in the beginning, that binding targets to reduce the greenhouse gases in the protocol was till 2012. Therefore, the second commitment period to reduce the emission levels was signed in the year 2012 at Doha, which is the capital and the most populous city of the state of Qatar, situated in Middle East. Therefore, this is also known as Doha Amendment. So, what was the net outcome of this Kyoto Protocol? Please note down. That is, number one, introduction of carbon credit mechanism, which we have discussed. Number two, common but differentiated responsibility. Number three, CDM, meaning clean development mechanism, and developed world also pledged to provide around 500 million US dollar fund to execute this protocol. Remember, pledge is different and actual amount given to this program is different issue. However, it is important to note that the Kyoto Protocol came into force in the year 2005. So, we lost how many years? We lost 8 years to arrive at its execution level. That is also without apparent US involvement. The biggest you can say in terms of historical contribution of carbon dioxide emission to the atmosphere, the biggest country or contributor is the United States. Now, let us take another major development in the field of environmental programs, and that is the UN Millennium Development Goal. I am repeating, UN Millennium Development Goal, that is another program. This Millennium Development Goal came into existence after the 3-day summit held at New York in the year 2000. So at that time it was the largest ever gathering of the world leaders under one roof, that was the UN roof, United Nations roof. So this Millennium Development Goal ultimately became a declaration in which 8 important targets were identified for more peaceful, prosperous and the just world. The target year for achieving these goals was 2015, and these goals were, please note down, number 1, eradication of extreme poverty and including the hunger. Number 2, achieving universal primary education. And number 3, promoting gender equality. Number 4, reducing child mortality. Number 5, improving maternal health. Number 6, combating HIV, AIDS, malaria and other diseases, and ensuring environmental sustainability. And the last, number 8, and the most important, that is the developing global partnership for the development. Now later in the year 2015, these goals were redesigned in new framework at UN General Assembly in form of 17 SDGs, meaning 17 Sustainable Development Goal. We will study these goals in detail in the next module on global environmental programs and policies. So that's all for the present module and today, and thanks for listening and watching, and please leave your feedback and question in the comment section. So bye bye.